The funeral is about to begin, sir.
Good evening. You're listening to Morningside FM, the podcast where we talk all things Phantasm. And tonight the funeral is indeed about to begin because I'm joined by my bandmate, co-author and sister-in-law, Zoe Swan, to talk all things funereal. Before we get into tonight's conversation, just a little content warning. We will be going into quite a lot of detail about the funeral industry, decomposition and burial practices. So if any of that might be upsetting, unsettling or offensive to you, you may want to skip this episode. Zoe, hi. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
I mean, we've known each other for about 20 years and I've spent most of that time just going on about Phantasm, so this was inevitable, but thanks for sticking with me for 20 years.
It's been hard,
yeah.
But, you know.
Yeah, I'll let you go after this, I promise. Just for the listeners, briefly, before we get down to all things Phantasm, tell us a little bit about you.
So, yes, as you said, we are intrinsically linked in many different ways by marriage and authorship and band. So I'm the bassist in Discord, which is a Blackpool punk band. Seaside Punk is what we normally get called. And I'm also the co-author of Convent Crescent with yourself. And I also actually published my debut novel last year, which is called Chingle Hall.
Excellent. And Discord sometimes masquerade as the Never Dead as well. I've
Yes,
no idea where we got that name from.
I don't know either. No, I've heard that we do that too.
So, I mean, I know the answer to this question, and the listeners can probably guess, but when did you first discover Phantasm?
This really annoying person that I know. Yeah, I came to Phantasm through you, and I'm really glad. I think you probably were making me pass the test of friendship.
Yes. Before
Before you decided to introduce it to me. You know, it had to be over a certain amount of years. Is she worthy? How will she react?
That's why I don't have any other friends.
And I'm very lucky, I think, to have watched it on Halloween as well. So it was a Halloween evening
Yes.
that we sat down and we watched it, and it was unlike anything I've ever seen before. And I think whilst obviously it's horror, it was so sort of Lynchian, and the dreamlike aspect of it that's what sucked me in.
It's weird.
It's weird, yeah, and it gets under your skin, definitely.
We watched it on a double bill, didn't we? With Phantasm and then straight into The Devil Rides Out.
We did.
I was just making you watch all the bizarre retro horror films that I liked.
Yeah, not everybody in the room saw all of the films. I think
No.
you had some people falling asleep, but definitely the two weirdest people in the room were hooked.
But anyway, apart from the fact that you're one of my oldest and closest friends, there was a very particular reason I wanted to talk to you about Phantasm and funerals, which is because when I met you, you worked in the funeral industry.
Yes, I did. So all those years ago, I worked at a crematorium, which, unlike Morningside, we do run them slightly different in the UK. And I was a crematorium operator, so I was actually there in the back doing the deed, shall we say. And we also did services as well. So we had a 3-week rota. 1 week you would actually be cremating. The next week you would be attending the services. So you'd be doing the music, you'd be greasing the funeral cortege. And then you'd also assist with burials.
Wow.
So there was plenty of time outside scampering about the cemetery, as much as there was sort of wandering around the chapel, but sadly it wasn't as impressive as the mausoleum at Morningside.
You mean you didn't have a space gate?
I didn't.
Wow.
No. I should have written a complaint about that, to be honest.
Or maybe you just never found it.
No, maybe I didn't.
Now, I don't know if this is true or not. And, well, first of all, I'm English also and have no way of verifying this. And some people might listen to this and be very offended or very angry. I have heard from multiple sources, I don't know about these days, but certainly in the 90s, when enough time had passed sort of culturally for Phantasm to have become embedded in the, not necessarily the pop culture psyche, but the, the subculture psyche. I've heard it said that in America, if you have a gathering of one or more morticians, there will be a kind of little silence. They'll look around the room, make sure there's no normal folk about, and then say, "Did you get into this because of Phantasm?" And the others will go, "Yeah."
Well, that's cool.
Which might sound just beyond the pale to your average your average punter. So on a serious note, what was it that made you want to get into the death industry?
So I think that is a really good point, actually. And I wonder how many American funeral directors do actually meet up and say that. What would be the collective noun for a group of funeral directors? A corpse.
A service.
A service. But yeah, I think in my experience, we all seem to have some kind of trauma in common, in that everybody that I sort of spoke to, more or less, had suffered a loss. So, and that's obviously not for everybody, but the majority of people that I spoke to in the industry, they had in their youth or early sort of 20s suffered a loss and were marked by it in some way. Now, some people had a really positive experience and wanted to be part of it because of that. And other people, like myself, unfortunately, had a not so positive experience. Yeah. And it sort of came about that the way I saw things being done just for this particular incident, it wasn't for everybody, but I definitely didn't want anybody else to go through that pain again. There were a lot of missteps, a lot of things that they shouldn't have been letting us see or do. And it was just the empathy of, I do not want anyone to ever feel like this, again. So that's what drew me to it. But I do also agree that there's also something else with a lot of people in the industry, that we are a bit strange in some way, like if you aren't scared of dark things, then it's something that you might be drawn to, shall we say.
But it's interesting that you said, I mean, not to trivialize that, but obviously everybody experiences loss at some point in their life. That's just inevitable, an inevitable part of being human. But you mentioned when they were in their teens or their 20s, and it's almost like perhaps if you're not completely emotionally equipped to deal with something like that and it happens early on, it leaves you with this sense of something to be resolved. And in a strange way, that reminds me of the film, because you have this teen protagonist, and of course it's all about death and loss and grief, and how literally you take the fantastical elements of it, like he's trying to rationalize this process that is. And you were, well, without wanting to get too personal, you were 13 when you lost somebody very close to you. Yeah,
absolutely. It was my my papa who passed away, and it completely imprinted on my psyche. And I think that's the same thing that happens with Mike. He loses his parents. He has nightmares about Morningside, just for the way that the death care industry works in America. They have Tommy very, very quickly. It's like Morningside already have him.
He did die very conveniently close to the mausoleum.
Yeah, almost like it was planned.
No.
But yeah, so for Mike, it was a similar experience. And I think that you either, when something traumatizes you, you're either drawn to it or you are terribly afraid of it. And sometimes both. Yeah.
And it's that morbid fascination.
It is.
And I find it interesting in terms of, what you were saying about being a bit weird and not being afraid of the dark, and not being like, we were both, those weird spooky kids who wanted the ghost stories, and we wanted to watch the scary film. Not so much because we weren't afraid, but because we were drawn to it.
Yes.
We like being scared. Yeah. And also it's that morbid fascination to go, and if something freaks you out, to find out everything about it. Yeah. Whereas Don Coscarelli, the writer and director of Phantasm, I don't think was one of those kids. I've read his memoir, wonderful book, True Indie. And he just seemed like, from my British perspective, like an all-American kid into building rockets and driving cars. And he's frequently said that he was terrified of the concept of death, and still is, even, he's probably in his 60s, maybe even 70s now.
Yeah.
He said he still hasn't come to terms with the fact that he will die one day. And this whole process was kind of like subconsciously him addressing that fear. The films are fantasies, or, that they're not even supposed to be realistic. They're fantastical horror films with this kind of underlying motif of death and the burial process but what I've always wondered, and I'm sure what a lot of people have wondered, is how realistic the portrayal of that industry is in the films. If you take the grave robbing, interdimensional, evil alien mortician out of it,
squished down corpses into killer dwarves. Surprisingly accurate in many areas and hilariously inaccurate in lots of others. So for one, like one of the very first scenes that you see after Tommy's died, and when we're actually at the graveside, you see this big white hearse coming in, and it's side opening because the caskets there in the US are so big. It's not like our little coffins in the UK. Now we do have caskets, but
tell
they're
the
less
listeners
common.
the difference between a coffin and a casket, because they're often used interchangeably, which is not correct.
Yes, well, exactly. And I think the best way to put it is a casket is a big rectangular box with a lifting lid, usually quite ornate, very, very comfy looking inside. And a coffin is the thing that you see Dracula rise from.
Yeah. Just as a little sidebar, and I'm sure listeners know this because they're Phantasm fans, but the name of the film came from Edgar Allan Poe, because both Don and Reggie were reading his stuff while they were filming it, and they were stuck for a title. It was going to be called Morningside, but then Don said, Poe keeps using this word, phantasm. It's great. Let's use it. And whenever I have to write the word coffin, I always try to get oblong box in there instead, because that was a classic Poeism.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, you were talking about the side opening white hearse.
I mean, and that in itself is very accurate to America. Not just white hearses, but they definitely have them. But they have, these big cars with these big side openings, and then almost immediately after that, you have a really big inaccuracy in that, well, obviously it's very, very scary that the tall man then lifts the casket. But the really weird thing for me watching it was, why wasn't the casket lowered in the first place? Now, if that had happened, the entire film would probably be pointless, because Mike wouldn't have seen this horribly alien sort of feat of strength.
And if they were having these sham funerals only to then take the coffins out of the grave, surely they wouldn't go to the effort of lowering them in. So
exactly. But yeah, so there's lots of things they got right. So especially in Phantasm 2,
there's more in the funeral home in Phantasm 2.
There's loads more, and I believe Don went to great pains to use real locations.
Well, I was only reading just before you got here, just purely coincidentally. I was reading about Phantasm, but and they mentioned the fact that the in Phantasm 2, when Mike and Reggie are on the road tracking down the tall man, and Mike sees the sort of well, it's not really a vision, it's real, but it's a sort of a phantasm, and it looks like Liz, but it isn't, and it's the hideous thing, and they set it on fire. But that was filmed in a real abandoned crematorium.
Yes,
I didn't know. I didn't know that.
That's the thing, and so it really strikes me that, because that crematorium looks like Freddy's boiler room.
Yeah, it really. It's because I knew that the main one, Perigord Cemetery, was a set. Really, really great set. But,
really
so
good set.
And because the early abandoned one looked so horrific, I just assumed it had been made for that purpose. But no, that's real.
Wow. I mean, it really does look like a horror set. Yeah, definitely. And just the scale of it, it's absolutely huge, and it's got this one sort of burner in the corner with this huge space all around it, and I'm thinking, what is this? But I guess it must have been in the cellar of a funeral home. So there's lots of things they used. Don, like I said, used real locations. He used the tables in the mortuary and things like that. It even shows the drains underneath the table and that kind of thing. So he really hit the mark, I think, on quite a lot of things. There's a great scene where Tall Man's sewing up a mouth.
Right.
And they actually do that. Oh, they don't so much sew
I've
anymore.
always wondered about that scene.
Yeah, so the reason that we sew mouths is because otherwise, during rigor mortis, the jaw will fall open and the mouth will pull into this rictus grin. Really, that's exactly what it is.
In my head, in my Dickensian head, we still tied corpses shut.
Exactly.
Because when I think of that, I always think of Marley in A Christmas Carol when he unties it and his mouth falls open.
Yeah.
And for a twee Christmas Story, it's actually horrific.
Yeah, and because you are strange and unusual, you know the reasoning behind that. Now, most people seeing that version of Jacob Marley, they won't really get why there's an undertaker's cloth tied around his head, and it's exactly that. Now today, some people who are old school still sew mouths, but they might put wax in there as well. There's also things like little spring-loaded wires that you can put in the mouth.
Wow.
There's all different things that they do, even glue, just to
God.
stop. And the whole point, so later on, you see... when you see Lizzie's grandfather come back and his mouth's got all these stitch marks on it and things like that. I mean, maybe Tall Man doesn't really care about his craftsmanship. Why would he? But the whole point is that these corpses these deceased are going to be on display.
Yes,
they're going to be viewed by family. So the stitches would not be visible. You know, these people doing this, it's an art, and they would take great pains to make sure there would be nothing visible. But I mean, it doesn't look as cool.
It doesn't look as cool because
when you're climbing into a bedroom at night,
where she gets in the bed and puts the light on, then rolls over and he's there.
Yeah,
that scared me so much. I was probably about 12 when I saw that for about a month I slept diagonally in the bed with my feet on one side and my head on the other, so I would know if there was anything else in the bed with me. It's like, you know, when they said that people were scared to have a bath after watching Jaws. For me, it was scared to get into bed after seeing Phantasm 2. I still watched it every day, though.
Well, that's your fault.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot more jump scares into, aren't there? Because it's more of a straight up horror.
No dream scenes.
No dream scenes, no. But inaccuracies, I would say, we've got some strange things. Like later on in one, we've got Jodie saying he lifted that casket. Mike says it must have been about £500. Well, you know, caskets probably, I mean, they can get really, really big and ornate, of course, but probably about 150 to £200, and then the weight of the deceased inside. So I don't think Tommy was like,
he didn't look that big.
No, he didn't. But still, it would be an insane amount for somebody to lift, definitely. And then there was one bit that did make me chuckle into where they have... So where you see actual Tall Man, and he's there and he's working on a deceased, and then it looks like a morgue. So you've got some chillers in the back, and you've got somebody on the table. But then on the back shelf, you just have a row of urns of ashes. And I was thinking, why do we have these things together?
Well, that brings me to my next question. Well, it's not really a question, but something that, again, always intrigued me. Was this idea of, if you take, you know, even in the first film, Morningside Mausoleum, and in my head, but then, you know, as I've said before, I just have this sort of gothic Victorian brain. But for me, a mausoleum conjures a certain image, and it's not Morningside. And I think of a funeral home as a particular thing with particular jobs, and I think of, you know, the church service is one thing, and a burial is one thing, or interring ashes is another thing, and a crematorium is kind of its own thing.
It is.
And in Phantasm, you have this. Is it a mortuary? Is it a funeral home? Is it a crematorium? Is it a chapel? It seems to be all of them. It's a under one roof
shop.
Yeah.
Of absolutely everything.
Death is us.
Death are us. So yeah, that is one of the biggest differences, in that we really have different trades. We do have some funeral homes in which they have lots of extras that they can offer. So you might have an in-house embalmer, Not that we use embalming as much as they do in the US, because we don't really go for public viewings. We have private viewings here. But they definitely seem to have everything. And it's always intrigued me, because it's not just in Phantasm. There's lots of other different American things where you see like 6 Feet Under and stuff like that, and you see them doing almost everything.
Right.
And it's really fascinating to me, because we don't do that over here.
Yeah.
We have a crematorium, which is a separate thing from a funeral home, which is a separate thing from a morgue, which is usually at a hospital.
Yeah. Why? Is it a religious thing? Is it because our practices are just much older? Sorry.
Yes, it absolutely is. For us, one of the major differences between US and UK funeral industry, and I'm no expert by any means whatsoever on this, because all my expertise is in crematorium work. So I was never a funeral director myself. However, I've worked with hundreds, and the main difference is that here in the UK, it's mostly still a family tradition. It's a family-run operation. It's why it's quite difficult to get into as an industry, because you have it handed down through generations.
I'm thinking of the Shuttleworths in Coronation Street,
Yes.
but that'll be lost on most listeners.
Yeah, we've got quite a few as well in Blackpool, really long-standing firms. They all have their own unique traditions that they do. And it's something handed down, where in America you can train and just get your funeral director's license
The minute you've seen Phantasm.
as soon as it's ended and the end credits are rolling. And you can study it here, but it's not often done in the same sort of way. And the similarity we have is that we do still have a license and go to school for embalming over here, like they do there.
But that, in terms of that all under one roof thing, again, it interests me in that sense that Don has always, famously said that this franchise came about from his fear of and fascination with what he has always called the American way of death. So not only is it this bizarre process where our loved ones' bodies are taken from us and changed and then ferried away somewhere.
Yeah.
You can sort of put a face to that whole process in a way that it's more sort of fragmented in terms of British practices.
Yeah.
And then that's sort of where the tall man comes from, isn't it?
He's actually the personification of that.
Yeah. But and then you can sort of not blame, but you have this person who is this avatar for all those strange things that happen, like embalming and like, that idea of sort of open caskets, and people go to see their relative and they've been prepared, and yet everybody says exactly the same thing. It wasn't really them.
Yes.
And that sense that they've properly gone and they've gone somewhere. And of course, getting into the sort of the fundamental fear of the film and the themes of it is like we don't know where we go after we die, if we go anywhere, and it's that true terror of the unknown. And it's funny because like Phantasm has this sort of third act U-turn where it suddenly becomes a sci-fi, which is really discombobulating when you watch it for the first time, and you get this kind of other dimension, the red planet, whatever it is, wherever it is, seems to be a kind of stand-in for the afterlife. But the interdimensional element gives it this sci-fi label. But I think the thing that makes cosmic horror what it is, I guess, is going right back to Lovecraft, that fundamental fear of the unknown.
Absolutely.
And even though all the sort of imagery and trappings of the funeral aspect of Phantasm is very sort of traditionally gothic in a lot of ways, it's the ultimate unknown. It's this idea that this person knows where you think you go to heaven, you come to us. This person knows, and that's why it's so frightening.
Yes.
And I think like it's very odd culturally that we don't talk about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that American way of death, that, and I know that was something that Don was really sort of inspired by. It refers to two things really. It's the actual sort of financial aspect of it, the vast commercialization of grief, and the the way that it's sort of sentimentalized and things like that. And the author of the book, The American Way of Death, she was Jessica Mitford, a very fascinating woman, actually. She was the daughter of a baron. So,
wow.
you know, she had a bit of an upper class kind of point of view, but she actually rebelled against her family completely. Because one sister was the best friend of Hitler and the other sister married Oswald Mosley.
Wow.
So she moved to America and joined the American Communist Party. So very,
Wow.
very different mindset. And I really appreciate what she did with the book, The American Way of Death, because she was basically saying that you're taking advantage of people's grief. But then you also have the other aspect, which is the alienness of it all. And that, I think, is what is so beautiful about Phantasm, and why we have this red planet and why we have this sci-fi element is because you're completely right. It's alien, it's other, it's unknown. So why not be aliens?
Yes.
You know, like, why not?
But alien in the truest sense of the word.
In the absolutely truest sense. And I think the thing that Phantasm shows us is the cost of handing over your dearly departed to strangers.
Yes. Oh,
there's
beautifully
consequence in the Phantasm universe.
Yes.
For doing that.
And this stranger in particular is very sinister. So, again, I can't help but wonder. Now, I've not seen this anywhere. I've not read this, but then, I mean, there must be people out there. There'll be lots of people out there who would consider the films in poor taste generally.
Yeah.
There must be people out there in the death care industry that consider the films very poor taste, and not just because, you know, it's a horror film with blood and guts set in a mausoleum, and from Phantasm 3 onwards filmed in a real mausoleum in Angelus Abbey in Compton, which is gorgeous. I love any scene set there, but the character of the tall man himself, there must be people out there who think, can we please stop being portrayed as being creepy and weird?
There absolutely is, because I read an entire article from the American Funeral Directors Association saying we need to really stop this trope of creepy, sinister undertakers, you know. And there were lots of things that they would like to stop, sort of inept funeral directors and the fear of the funeral and that kind of stuff. But it is kind of what makes us human.
Yeah, and also, I would say, you know, Phantasm, it's a schlocky 70s horror film, but it's art, and I think all art, it has a responsibility to represent, that's not really the right word, but present, rather, the fears of its creators, their hopes, their dreams, their passions. But I would say that idea of we need to stop this negative trope, that's all very well and good, but you have to ask, why is it a negative trope? Exactly. Yeah. And that's more of a societal issue that then, it's a bit like Tarantino and violence in films. It's like, you're not really looking at the wider problem here. What about you when you worked at the crematorium?
So did I think things like that were in poor taste? Or?
No, I've met you. No, in terms of other people, when you told people what you did for a living, how did they react? So
in a job I had after working at the crematorium, which wasn't in a crematorium, it was in a call centre, and people are very curious. Yeah. Like you said, that morbid sense of fascination with things. Anyway, they were asking questions and somebody started crying. So, I mean, I've had people be physically uneasy. They always think, especially I think being a woman in what has been quite a male-dominated practice previously, they are always like, oh, right, so did you arrange the flowers? Or, did you just sort of get people to sign the book and stuff?
Was there a fainting couch in case you saw a cadaver?
Yeah, exactly. Where in reality, when I had my interview for the crematorium, they did it in a normal sort of office environment. It was the sort of gatehouse for the cemetery. And then they took me down into the chapel itself without any warning. Took me into the room where we had our 3 different crematorium ovens, and somebody was in the process of removing a cooling box which was full of calcified bone, which had just been burnt down. And
Was it Sam Raimi?
It absolutely was, yeah. And without warning, Sam shoved this sort of box of bones, essentially, this burnt box of bones in front of my face.
Wow.
And said, "Does this scare you?" And I said, "Nope. No,
I mean,
it doesn't."
You
And
could
he
argue
said,
that's quite
"No."
insensitive, but I mean, get out now.
It was.
If you can't handle this.
They basically said that we've had 4 people in today who all said they would be absolutely fine working with the deceased, and they aren't squeamish, and they have a strong stomach. And the gentleman who'd been interviewed before me was actually an ex-military man, and then they'd done the exact same sort of shock thing to them, and all of them had either run out or nearly thrown up or just not been into it. And I was just like, yeah, that's fine. That was a person, and I believe they deserve respect.
Exactly.
And that's the reason I wanted to do it in the first place, is because I feel like every single human on this planet, regardless of how much they can afford for their funeral, deserves the exact same level of respect in death until they are either, ashes or in the ground.
That's beautifully said. And very respectful in an episode that may be considered slightly irreverent by some.
But that's his thing. Everybody in the industry has the most fantastic gallows humour.
I was going to say,
because you absolutely have to. So you can talk about, these kind of things and talk about Phantasm or talk about whatever. But then at the heart of it, you have this just absolute unwavering respect, which is why whenever that is called into question, it's such a big deal.
Yes, and I think, bringing it back to this film, and you could argue, about taste, but, the kind of the sinister mortician element aside, the main plot element and the one it takes so seriously is that sense of loss and grief. And I think that's what this film is about, and it's that same emotion that drives people to want to be part of that world.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to be crass again, I've got to ask, the crematorium scene in Phantasm 2, how realistic is it?
Well, I've got some bad news.
Go on.
If you were not dead.
Yes, we are referring, of course, to the scene in which one of the tall man's minions is thrown onto the gurney.
Yes.
And thrust
a great tick there.
Into the oven.
We do use gurneys.
Yeah.
In America, they have... And in a lot of places in the UK these days, like modern places, where I worked, it was quite old-fashioned, but they have these fantastic conveyor belts, pushing it in. Whereas what I did, it was all manual. You literally were physically pushing somebody in like a witch into an oven. But yeah, if you're in there and the door is closed and the cycle has started, we did not have any fail-safe to stop that process.
Wow. So
you have to really make sure because once it's started, we're not stopping that. You're in there. But that's never happened. It's never happened to me.
Good.
Yes.
A few years ago, I was going to a funeral, and it just so happened that I was staying somewhere the night before with some people. I was staying there because it was close to where the funeral was being held, and completely coincidentally, completely separate from this, we'd been saying for ages, we must watch Phantasm together, that film you like so much. And so it just happened that I'm staying here because I've got to go to this funeral in the morning. And well, let's watch Phantasm. And then there was a moment's hesitation, and someone said, is that in poor taste? Is that appropriate? I said, I think it's entirely appropriate.
Yeah. I
mean, I would say that. But honestly, because, even if it's not someone you're hugely close to, a funeral's an emotional time, and sometimes you're more there for the bereaved than yourself and your relationship with the deceased. And it's an incredibly introspective and somber thing for anyone. And again, back to that idea of those themes in Phantasm, in terms of thinking about loss, but also, you start to philosophize on the nature of life and death and what we are and where we go. And maybe the film is just a Rorschach blot, and we project our own, fears and anxieties about death onto it. But I think it's a really good cathartic watch
Yes.
when you're in that headspace. And then I said, you know what? I think from now on until my own funeral, whenever I'm going to a funeral in the morning, I'm going to watch Phantasm the night before. In the same way that there are certain songs you have to listen to at a certain time just to channel a certain emotion. And I thought it's not in poor taste. It's not disrespectful. It's me having some much needed catharsis.
Absolutely, because the film helps process more emotion than just normally going to a funeral. And that's, because it's through Mike's perspective. It's through his child's eyes, his teenager's eyes, and these unspeakable horrors of these people that he loves being taken away, and then what? And I think if you were going to a funeral, it's more seen in poor taste in Western culture to show too much emotion at funerals. So if you wanted to process that before you went, I would say, listen and watch anything you want to try and get all those emotions processed.
So I can't help but wonder, as somebody who worked in a crematorium, do you want to be cremated or buried when you die?
I would like to be buried. I didn't solely work in a crematorium. I also assisted with burials. I have family members who have been cremated and family members who've been buried. But for me personally, I would like to go back to the earth. And it's something that we have that's quite unique here in Europe, in that when we are buried into the earth. In America, a lot of the time, they are in vaults. So
that was another thing about the strangeness of Morningside, is this idea, and it looks so gorgeous, that mausoleum with those wall crypts.
Oh yeah.
But as a kid watching that, I was thinking,
what is it?
Why are the bodies filed away?
Yeah, it does
like documents.
They are like documents.
Or it looks like a morgue,
Yes.
when the body is...
We have a tendency to bury down deep, and they sometimes have a tendency to bury up into a mausoleum. And we do have mausoleums over
literally
here.
Dust to dust.
Dust to dust.
But when I think, well, no, obviously, as a diehard Phantasm fan, when I think mausoleum, I think Morningside. But when I actually seriously think mausoleum, I think of somewhere like Highgate Cemetery and tombs and vaults. And it's a very different thing, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So in America, when they are lowered down into the earth, they are usually, not always, but usually in a vault, or there are at least foundations underneath the grave, which is really interesting to me, because this is why you see an American cemetery and I feel like they look very strange to what I'm used to. And that's because all the graves are straight.
There's no subsidence.
And they would sort of say to us, like, well, why don't you use foundations? But that beautiful image of a Gothic cemetery with the higgledy-piggledy graves.
And I'm thinking of the ghoul gates in Neil Gaiman's Graveyard book.
Yes, yeah, all of that comes from the fact we are going into the earth and there's nothing holding that stone up, really.
No.
But
not even time.
Not even time.
Fundamentally.
Yeah, but that's what I want to... Yeah. That's how I would like to end.
And is that from a desire just to be in the earth?
Yeah, and like I really did enjoy cremation. I would, in a heartbeat do it again. But I do feel like there's a lot of steps. People think that when you go in and you're burned, that's it, you're a nice little pot of ash and that's the end, amen. And that's not the case whatsoever. There's quite a few steps to get to that urn, really. And I just don't want messing about with. I just want to put me in a box and put me in the ground, or throw me in the trash, however you want.
As Frank Reynolds would say.
As Frank Reynolds would say, yes.
Which is more environmentally friendly, would you say?
Well, burial, definitely, over cremation. Cremation was really thought to be such an eco practice back in the sort of Edwardian period, where it was becoming... when it was sort of birthed, and then it got quite popular. And Beatrix Potter famously was one of the first people cremated in this area, and did so because she thought it would have less impact on the earth, when in fact, those chimneys are churning out quite a lot of pollution. and burial into the ground is better, but space, we need the space, so do we really want to fill it with cemeteries? So
Yes.
there's lots. Yes, I know. I do. There's lots of different ways. They're inventing modern ways all the time. There's one way at the minute where you can be put in a chamber that sort of boils you at a very high temperature. And essentially
I feel like another cult horror franchise is
think
about to
so.
be born.
Yes.
Somebody's going to be boiled too young. And
Yeah.
but again, so we're very much talking about this from a sort of Anglo-centric point of view, if indeed Anglo-centric is a word. I feel like it should be.
It should be, but Western, I think, is probably...
But yeah, even we've talked about the differences between US and UK customs, but fundamentally, I think we are very, very similar, and our attitudes, certainly, to death and dying and the death industry, i.e. complete repression and denial, are very, very similar, which again, like we talked about before, kind of leans into that horror, and that's why we find these characters sinister. Again, just to go back to that, and sort of not in defense of the creepy mortician trope, but in defense of the tall man, it's the mystery that is sinister, not the practice or the process. So what I'm curious about is how other cultures treat death and dying and burial. Yeah,
and the answer is wildly differently. And you're completely right with saying that our Western idea of death is it's not even just sort of denial, it's defying. You want to preserve people, you want to
denial is really good.
They want almost just like you defy death, embalm them. I don't want them to look any different. I want them to be youthful forever or look the same.
God, did I mention that 70s horror, and you just put me in mind of the Amicus anthology. I think it's Tales from the Crypt, where they do the monkey's paw, and she wishes her husband back to life, but he's been embalmed and he's just screaming in pain, and they take the axe to him, and he's like severed all his limbs, but he won't die, and the hands are writhing around. Because again, you were talking about how you did burials as well, and it's very rare these days that you go to a burial. I've been to a few, and all the funerals I've been to where there is a graveside service about to begin have been Catholic funerals.
Yes.
Because, of course, in that religion, there is this literal concept of resurrection.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to be whole.
You need to be whole.
Yeah, definitely. And even to the point where organ donation, no, keep me whole. I'm going to be resurrected. But
I always think of Dracula in Whitby. And it's Mina, isn't it, talking to the Yorkshire fisherman about the absurdity of well, what about the graves that are washed away, when the trumpets sound, where will they be?
Where will they be?
But when the trumpets sound, what about people who are full of embalming fluid?
Well, they're not going to be very happy, I don't think. But it's definitely, it differs all around the world, and I think there are cultures who have much healthier ways of dealing with death. They're not in denial, they're not trying to defy decomposition, because when we get to the very sort of brass tacks of all of this, we're not that scared of death or scared of the unknown or scared of where we go. We're scared of decomposing. We're scared of the rot. We're scared of what we're going to look like and all of these things. And there's other cultures around the world where they're not scared of that. And it puts me in mind of there's a people in Indonesia where they have a specific festival in which they exhume their deceased.
I read about that, yeah.
And they clean the corpse and they dress it and they brush their hair and they take absolute beautiful care of their loved one. And then they will sit with them in their home and they will have a meal. And
as you are now, so once was I.
Yeah, exactly. And every year that they do that they exhume that person, they are going to look more and more different. And they're not necessarily perfectly preserving these people when they do that. They are going through a decomposition process, but they're not scared of it. And they still feel very, very in touch with their deceased, which is beautiful. And of course, you've got the famous Day of the Dead in Mexico and, going to the graveside, sitting with your deceased and having a feast and, just really celebrating them. And not being scared. It's a loving festival. And I know it's kind of been absorbed into sort of Western culture.
Yeah,
and
Halloween makeup.
You see it, like all bandied around. When in reality, it's a very important and beautiful festival that they have.
Even where we live, nearby, there are some Polish war graves.
Yeah.
And every November, which for US listeners, that's when our Remembrance Day is.
Yeah.
But the graves there are kept immaculately,
Beautiful,
the grass
yeah.
around them, and they people come. I think they're lurkers maybe from Phantasm, because I never see them, but the moment that dusk falls, there are candles lit on the graves, and
Hundreds
it's
of candles,
beautiful, sort of sense of remembrance.
Yeah.
And it's not particularly morbid. It's quite, seeing it is quite serene.
It's very peaceful.
Yeah. Definitely.
It's because the people there usually are at peace with what's happened, and that sort of penetrates. But there's lots of different ways that people around the world observe death, and it's not always in sadness. It's a celebration. There's this great thing that happens in Southern Africa where they actually have like a multi-day festival. They'll have 2 funerals. They'll have one where they're actually,
second funeral
committed, having a committal, and then they'll have, let's have a second funeral, and it's a huge party, and there's poetry and music, and it's just a completely different way of looking at things. And you also have the amazing sounding Tibetan sky burial, where that is such a reflection of their culture. They're up
I don't
high.
really know about that.
So when somebody passes, they will go and lay their body out on the mountainside, and vultures will come down and consume the deceased.
Of course, yeah.
Now you've got to think about the practicality of things. Like when you are up in really high altitude, there's not really the kind of ground that you can bury. And how far do you have to travel down to get to somewhere where you can start burying people? And in how long will that take? And will you get into the stage where it's not going to look great if you are carrying somebody during putrefaction down the mountainside? But so what they do is they leave the body out, and it's taken by the vultures. But that's because they see there the spirit literally flying into the next world, and it's consumed and taken with the birds. And I just think that is such a very beautiful practice.
And I think in our culture, we've lost that to a degree. It's become that repression, that denial that we talked about. That wasn't always the case. If you look back to sort of like, Anglo-Saxon
photography.
Well, I'm going way further back. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was an American podcast, and they had to clarify what the word barrow meant for some of their listeners because they weren't familiar with it. And I thought, well, of course, it's not something that's, here. Like it's a prominent place name because there are so many barrows, and that harkens back to a different idea of death and a different burial. But in going back to what you were saying about, the fear of the rot, we were talking actually before we started recording. We were talking about sort of vampire myths and how a lot of that came about from people not understanding decomposition.
Yeah.
And, that idea that a corpse's fingernails would continue to grow after. They don't. It's just that the skin around the fingers shrinks, and it makes the nails look like talons. And if people are buried face down, as they sometimes were, blood will pool around the lips and, various things. And it's that we don't see it, and we're protected from it. When you are presented with it, it seems horrific and terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to me, like, the tall man is equal to and opposite that, because he's what you get when it's hidden, when it's completely hidden, and you have on the one point a person who is alive, and then suddenly you've got that open casket funeral, like Tommy in the first scene of Phantasm, where you can tell it's the same guy, but he just looks a bit wrong, a bit too perfect, almost made up. And,
they do. And absolutely that. And everything about Tall Man and Morningside, it's so clinical, it's so sterile. You've got the white plantation house, you've got the white hearse, you've got the white marble mausoleum.
It feels cold.
It's cold. It's you give me them and I'll handle it.
Yeah. And it might be worth mentioning we're recording this in pretty much the hottest week of the year, which might not sound much, but in England it's never warm, and we're in the north of England where it's never warm and it always rains. So maybe it's because I live somewhere where it's always grey and raining, but there was always a kind of exoticism to, I know the film's set in Oregon, I believe, but it was filmed mainly in California. It looks so summery and bright, and maybe that's not deliberate, maybe that's just how it looks where it was filmed. But I always think, possibly weirdly, I always think of Phantasm as a summer film, and I always want to watch it. It's summer.
Yeah, but then you have at the end all those amazing autumn leaves that are swirling around in the wind, and it's that always struck me as like, it is very summery. It's, it's green, it's lush, it's blue skies, it's all American. And then you have this scene at the end, and all these dead leaves are being...
Exactly,
and I feel like, obviously, that's
the point of no return.
That represents, now we're starting to get into the death.
Exactly, yeah. And that's the thing, because, the kind of obvious or easy thing to do would have been to set the film at Halloween or in autumn, because it's spooky and eerie. But for me, and again, I don't know if this was a deliberate choice, we were going to set this film, with these kind of sunny vistas almost of it, the long shots of the street, like when Jodie's on his bike and Mike's chasing him, it looks, and maybe people who live in that area don't think this, but to me it looks vaguely idyllic, Yeah,
no, it does.
And it should be summery, because it's blue sky and ice cream and chilled beer, contrasted with that cold marble and the dark that waits.
Absolutely.
And you're so right, that moment where you have the swirling leaves, it's when Reggie dies.
It is.
And that's that's it. That's because to summer, December is the red planet.
It is.
And that's that's the fear.
It absolutely is.
Thank you so much for talking to me about all things death and funereal. Who'd have thought that we'd enjoy that conversation, eh? But just to wrap up, slightly more lightheartedly, favourite Phantasm film of the 5?
Ooh, I think it has to be the first one.
Yeah.
Obviously.
The original and classic.
The original, classic. I appreciated the actual sort of crematorium scenes in the second one.
Yeah. The second one looks gorgeous.
Yeah,
and I think
they had
Angus
the massive budget.
Is kind of, maybe this is sacrilegious, but he's more the tall man in the second one. I think, is he in it more? Is the character more well realised? He's a little bit older, and he just looks brilliant. And his voice is brilliant. His presence is...
There's that scene where they go to the abandoned town, and all of the graves, all of the coffins or caskets have been sucked from the earth almost. And it's just this empty, desolate graveyard. And I feel like that is such a moving scene.
Yeah.
And for me, it sort of really hits home that this threat is real, not just to their town, but now to America. And then hopefully, like they think the world. So, that scene, I think, is one of my favourites, even though the first film is my favourite.
There is a montage of shots at the beginning of the fourth one, and I'm always obviously the first one will always occupy that special place in my heart, but the fourth one really has something too. And that opening montage of just bizarre clips from the previous 3 films is just so aesthetically pleasing, and that is the shot in that montage that always stands out the most. And it's really funny because it's one of the few. Well, no, it's the only shot of Mike they can show from Phantasm 2, because it's a different guy, but he's got his flamethrower helmet thing on, so...
You don't know.
Perfectly.
You don't know that it's not him.
All right, before I let you go, I am going to put you on the spot.
Oh, my God.
I've got Killian H. Gore's unauthorised Phantasm quiz book. I'm opening this on a random page.
Oh, dear.
Even I don't know. All right. You may not know this, but you can have a good guess.
Okay.
Which death metal band sampled the theme tune from Phantasm on one of their albums? Is it A, Autopsy, B, Entombed, C, Celtic Frost, or D, Repulsion?
Entombed.
Of course it's Entombed. Well, there's another band called Funeral Whore who've
I've
got
seen-
an entire Phantasm
I almost
album.
bought their vinyl just because it said Phantasm on it.
Of course, yeah. But you bought me the Zoltan one.
Yes.
Did you buy me that? I know you
Yes.
got me the Captain Zorro disco remix, which is actually... I'm pointing like listeners can see, but it's framed on the wall. Right, Zoe, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And I hope you come back and talk even more about Phantasm with
more.
me,
Yeah.
if you can endure it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to come back.
Where can listeners find you and your stuff?
Well, you can find me at zoeswan.com. Actually, if I still have that domain, I'll have to check. But
Professional.
yeah, isn't it just? I think that's because there's nobody else with this weird name. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. So there we have it. Thank you so much to my guest Zoe Swan for talking to me about Phantasm and funerals. Don't forget to follow Morningside FM on Instagram at PhantasmPod and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts to be notified whenever we release a new episode. Until then, remember,
It's never over.